Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
Well, to all our guests joining, I'd like to say welcome to the Cognitive Crucible. I am your host, Doug Abdiel. For those who have listened before, you will notice that I am not your traditional host, John Bicknell. I've spent the last couple of decades on and off of active duty in the Marine Corps, in combat arms, IT, and the last decade in strategy, operations, and enterprise partnerships for Google. I have been an avid listener of the Cognitive Crucible for the last couple of years, and I'd like to introduce a very special guest. John Bicknell will be our interviewee today. John, as some of you may know, is the CEO and founder of More Cowbell Unlimited. He is also the vice president of the Information Professionals Association and the traditional host of the Cognitive Crucible. Now, before I move on to talking any more about what John has been working on for the last couple of years, I'd like to take a moment. We were having a bit of a sidebar about this before, and just reflect for the other service members who are in the crowd that transitioning from active duty after a couple of decades is hard. I've done it. John's done it. We get taught to put country before the Marines that we lead. We get taught to put our Marines before ourselves. We get asked to do that day in and day out. And then you get thrown into the private sector and you're expected to fly your own flag and say how awesome you are. And I had to nearly put a gun to John's head to tell him that he needed to come out and tell everyone the awesome work that he is doing at More Cowbell Unlimited. Otherwise, he felt it was just too self-promotional to use this great platform that he's built to talk about the work that he's done. So I hope that you will help me encourage John in the future to talk more about the great work that he's doing outside of just hosting this great podcast and the work that he does on, quote, on the side in this area. And I hope that you'll enjoy listening to some of his initial forays into this. And I'm looking forward to seeing More Cowbell Unlimited as it continues to develop. Thank you, John, for all the work that you have done in the Cognitive Crucible, for all the work that you've done for our country, and for all the work that you've done at More Cowbell.
Thank you for that, Doug, and great to be here.
I'd love to be a pale reflection of you, John, though I do believe I am a little bit more tan for those of us who are not watching. I'll still be a pale reflection of your questions and your skills as an interlocutor here. But I'd love to start off in a similar way to the way that you start off with your guests. What is your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times that we live in?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I promise, Doug, I won't do this throughout the podcast, but just a quick little sidebar. This question I ask just about every guest. It was really just kind of intended to be like maybe a little bit of a scene setter, but I found out that some people really stress this question because it's kind of a big question, and people put a lot of time and effort into nailing it. So I first just made it like, could we get your assessment of of our strategic landscape? But then I added, or if you prefer, the times in which we live, so that people have a little bit more room to meander, and it's not quite so such a big question maybe. So I'm going to choose door number 2, the times in which we live. Right.
Well, tell us what is behind door number 2 on this game show where you're the contestant today.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. So it occurs to me that every generation has its generational challenge, right? Something that has never been experienced before. And you can, just go back in recent memory, the, Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. It seems like every 20 years, the Cold War is its own thing too. Every generation has like a big moment where it has to rise to the occasion and figure something out or do something really hard. And, what I'm getting ready to say here is, maybe going to seem underwhelming, but it really undergirds the very fabric of everything that we are finding challenging today in the information space with cognitive security and its complexity. And complexity has been a kind of like a running theme for this podcast. I've done a lot of thinking about complexity. And I really do think that if we think about our problems in terms of complexity and how to manage complexity and compete in the face of complexity, that's part of the solution set. And we had a guy on the podcast a couple of years ago now, a guy named Josh Kerbel, who's with the US intelligence community, and he really appreciates complexity. And I like the way he talked about the Cold War, which was cognitively easier. And that's not to say that the Cold War was easy. It was hard. It was very dangerous. It was a moment, or it was a generational challenge for the people who were living through that 40 years ago. But cognitively, it was easier because it was less complex. It was a bounded problem. There were like two big players, the US and the former Soviet Union, right? And these two nation states they were traditional hierarchies. Just the entire chessboard was a little simpler, right? But today we've got complex systems, which are dynamic and nonlinear and networked, and there's the explosion, the proliferation of information and goods and services and ideas flowing across the world in a way that we have never experienced before, ever, right? And all of this is very difficult for people and for organizations and military units to grapple with, right? And all of this has a very explicit cognitive implication as well. And I mean, I can feel it in my daily life, I think, even, right? Um, I think of myself as a relatively engaged and a relatively tuned in guy, but I can sort of feel the overwhelm. And I even try to mitigate the feeling in my own life. So, like, here's just like some for examples. There's like a proliferation of choice, like channels, YouTube channels, Instagram channels, cable channels. There are apps that are popping up all over the place where people are communicating, right? Just a proliferation of choice to communicate globally. I mean, even going to the supermarket and trying to pick out ketchup, right? There are so many ketchups. There's so many mayonnaises. There's so many chips. It's really amazing. I've even gotten to the point where I am like unplugging, like when I go for walks, rather than pop in a podcast to listen to when I go for a walk, which I do all the time. But nowadays I have been not doing that so that I can just have a little bit of less chatter going on. So anyway, this is the kind of stuff that I've been thinking on and that we've been working on at More Cowbell Unlimited. But something else, all technology and all problems can be thought of as a double-edged sword too. So there's good stuff and there's bad stuff. And even though complexity is a major challenge, I also think of complexity as an opportunity.
Look, so much of what you said there just resonates with me. You know, to get a bit academic, the old realist theory about mutually assured destruction was very, very straightforward, right? Like, if you launch at me, I'm going to launch at you, and we're all going to die. So we're just not going to do that, right? And that balance of power prevented potentially great power conflict for the better part of the Cold War. And now we are in this world of the world that we fought in, rogue individual actors flying airplanes into the Twin Towers, or now rogue quasi-government entities hacking into computer systems. The world is significantly more complex. And I have never heard someone bring together the paradox of choice in the way that you have. I too love the McDonald's value menu, not for its nutritious content, but because darn it, I know what a number one supersize tastes like,
There you go.
and it's
There you
simple
go.
and straightforward, no matter where you go.
There you
Um,
go. I read somewhere recently, or maybe I just heard a little blurb somewhere that at Starbucks, some of the employees have, really made a fuss about the orders that are coming in to Starbucks that are so specialized and so boutique that I'm not sure what Starbucks is doing about it. It's probably like, well, if the customer wants a blah 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 string it all together latte, then make it for them. But that kind of specificity is really hard for people to deal with, and that is happening across the entire globe.
Yeah, it's really interesting to talk about the double-edged sword of that. Like the average human can only hold, what is it, 7 to 9 items in their working memory at a given time. And
That's
when you
Yep.
get too much complexity, it's impossible for them to move forward. So, look, I'd love if you can talk through you don't speak like the average Marine, and I can say that as another Marine. All right, like we've only on that chart of the evolution of man, like we do our best to stay
Uh-huh.
quite close to the ground with our knuckles, and we're well renowned for that. And it's a reputation that we won't shake off lightly, even if if we have. So, could you share with me a little bit about your background in the Marine Corps and cognitive security? It's not locating with, closing with, and destroying the enemy by fire and maneuver as we were taught to do. And maybe you could share a little bit about why you wanted to found More Cowbell Unlimited, and your background in this space, because it's a non-traditional path for another Marine.
Sure. Yeah. And by the way, hat tip to you there, Doug. You just gave a reference to a really famous study by a guy named George Miller called The Magic Number Seven, plus or minus two, from the 1950s. And the only reason why I know that is because another Cognitive Crucible guest told me about it, Kara Masick, who is a Air Force PSYOP officer, but she turned me on to that, and I've actually referenced that in some of our material. Let me start with More Cowbell Unlimited. So, what we are is a process technologies, data science, and software company. And so, what we do is we simplify and visualize complexity so that organizations can orient on the dynamic systems that are affecting operations and improve decision making. So that's what we do. And there is definitely a touch point with all of that and what I did in the Marines. So halfway through my Marine career, so I was on active duty from 1990 to 2010. And halfway through there, I went to the Naval Postgraduate School and I got a degree in operations research. It was actually a manpower degree, but it had a very strong operations research component bolted onto the side of that package. And then, like all Marine Corps Naval postgraduate students, you do a payback tour in the discipline that you studied at the Naval Postgraduate School. So I worked at the headquarters of the Marine Corps in the manpower department. It's called MNRA, Manpower and Reserve Affairs. And I was in charge of, basically managing the entire first term enlisted Marine Corps, from a human supply chain perspective. And so it was a whole bunch of like really nerdy, awesome, I loved it, operations research and looking at the human resources supply chain as a process and identifying across all 200 job skills or MOSs, admin, logistics, all the varieties of aviation, public affairs, infantry, artillery, tanks, everything, right? So we analyzed all 200 job skills so that we could calculate how many people do you need to shove into the front end of the pipe in order to produce the proper number of Marines and deliver those Marines to the operating forces. I mean, it was a great job. I really loved it. And all of that operations research and decision science that went into that, there's a direct line of sight between that and what we're doing at More Cowbell Unlimited.
Look, John, I don't like to give unsolicited advice here, but Lieutenant General Glynn may be listening. He's the current head of MNRA, and
Yeah, right.
he may just want to recall you to active duty. I
Okay.
can't talk, I don't know of too many other individuals who look at their payback tour in the Pentagon so fondly that
That's
they
right.
want to continue doing it post departure from the Marine Corps. But hey, everybody has their own story. Now, what about the field of cognitive security? So that makes sense from a operations planning
Yeah.
perspective, but you could apply that same type of filtration mechanism and organizational design perspective to anything. Why cognitive security?
Yeah, I didn't get into the cognitive security aspect of your question there. Yeah, so let me touch on that now. So, by the way, and let me give a really big shout out to a gentleman named Dr. Rand Waltzman. At the core of the business is process technologies. We look at the world as unfolding processes which can be analyzed in order to understand the flow of information through systems. And the the commercial capability that's being used throughout the world currently is called process mining. And that is for businesses to model the administrative processes which run the business, right? And so process mining is a data driven way, an objective way of modeling and presenting and visualizing processes so that mature organizations can identify where the bottlenecks are, where the rework is, where are compliance steps being missed, and these kinds of things in order to save the business money or to de-risk the processes across the businesses. So that was originally what we were looking to do, is to use process mining in a business context. But it quickly became apparent to me that that was not going to be a viable path forward. So I started thinking about, well, how else can you use this capability and adapt it into national security applications? And I started thinking about it, how modeling emergent and self-organizing and naturally occurring systems and understanding the flow of information through these systems can also be thought of as processes. And so that led me to think about information operations and information warfare and being able to model these flows of information and get ahead of what is happening so that you can, better deal with the challenges of information warfare. And so that led me to Dr. Rand Waltzman. And so Rand was one of the very first people that I got connected up with in the information operations community back in 2019. I had a couple of conversations with Rand, and he suggested, hey, by the way, we recently stood up this new organization, IPA, the Information Professionals Association. Why don't you check it out? And so it was via Rand Waltzman that I got connected into IPA. And I was, after getting to know some folks a little bit more, they invited me to be the vice president. And uh, one of my ideas was to start this podcast. And so here we are. But Rand Waltzman has a great saying that I just want to, I've shared it a couple of times and I'd like to share it again, is that he thinks of cognitive security as a chronic disease with no cure, but it may be managed, right? And so with that, I think of, Rand is helping to set the stage for thinking about this as a continual competition, right? There is no end game. It's an infinite game. We have to manage the problem continually. So all of that runs right through everything that we're doing.
Look, there's so much that I want to build off there, and we only have an hour for this podcast. So I'll tell you a few light bulbs that ticked in my head, and I'll turn this into grunt speak as I think of it. One of the first courses I did at Columbia in the MBA program was an operations research program that looked at the work of a chap named Deming, who ended up going on, and his ideas got refined in the Toyota production system,
Yeah,
which
yeah, yeah, yeah.
makes those brilliant charts that you see. And really, it's a full actualization of calculus. Like you can see these processes together, and you can make them optimally more efficient in this way
Hmm.
and that way and
Hmm.
this way and that way. And what I think is interesting about the work that I've seen you do, and I want to get into it a little bit before, but um, to turn this into grunt speak, is you have recognized that there are these processes, and you have recognized that with the large number of these processes that one has to deal with in a management environment, that can create this paralysis, this problem, and just the overwhelming crush of information can be a detriment to those processes and create an opportunity for those who
Hmm.
are enterprising and hopefully the blue team instead of the red team
That's right.
on
Yeah.
this. So,
Yeah.
look, that's a bit of a teaser for what I wanted to ask you next. But in perhaps grunt speak, because I'm doing my best to keep up with you, John. Could you explain kind of the core functionalities of the new product? What does it do if you were explaining this to, you know, not the G39, but to your regular operations officer? What is this? What does this do to make his life easier?
Right. Right. The best way to think about the technology that we're rolling out right now is cognitive indicators. Cognitive indicators. And they are purpose built, designed to help commanders make informed, evidence based decisions to maintain the initiative, to gain situational awareness, identify new opportunities, and make more efficient resource allocations. And so, um, think of them just as like intelligence indicators, right? Which are observable characteristics. So these cognitive indicators are observable characteristics that all of the information operations tribes can use to support their planning, provide evidence-based situational awareness of the dynamic systems affecting operations.
Okay, so if I could play that back, I think what you're saying is this uniquely and cross discipline, be it, psychological operations, intelligence, what have you, provides a
Yeah.
bit of what we would have called IPB in the military context, that intelligence preparation of the battle space, but it's an ongoing picture of what the recipient is dealing with in terms of information flowing at them and when it might be a good time, what might be a good narrative, how previous narratives have affected them to allow you to then make a database decision rather than a gut-based decision on when you react and how you react most effectively. Perhaps if again I could turn this into grunt speak, you are talking about the number of other players on the field and what those other players are doing and what the effect is on the brain of the other commander or the other coach on the other side of that team. Is that a fair grunt speak summary of how this works, or is there
Uh,
something I missed?
I I would give it a B plus or an A minus. And
Oh, I'll take that. I'll take
well,
that. I was a
but
straight C student, John.
it's it's my fault because I guess I didn't explain it well enough. And maybe I should describe what I mean by cognitive indicators, right? So there are three different types of cognitive indicators. The first one is the likelihood of being cognitively overwhelmed. The likelihood of overwhelm. So we've got these measures, right? They're high, they're low, they're mid-range, right? And when the measures are high, it means that on average, the people who are experiencing that environment, experiencing that system, on average, those people are more likely to be cognitively overwhelmed for just the reason you talked about a few minutes ago, Doug, right? There's such a large variety of stuff in their environment that it's taking up more cognitive space. They've got less.
Somebody has flooded the zone with crap,
Yeah, yeah.
as we've talked about. Yeah,
Yeah, sure. I mean, it could be, being flooded with mis and disinformation, or it could be 100% truthful information. It's just a lot of different things, right? And so that's
fair enough.
that's that's the first kind of a cognitive indicator. The second kind of cognitive indicator would be like being able, a measure of intent or a measure of energy expenditure, resource expenditure, which can also be intent, right? So if you've got country or a non-state actor that has been um, spending a lot of time and effort and energy in one area of the world compared to another area of the world, we have heat maps that will illuminate that, where you can make the inference that that organization, it could be a multinational company like Exxon or Coca-Cola, or it could be an actor like China or the United States even, right? There's like a red teaming aspect to this too. You can visualize where they've been spending energy, and that helps communicate intent. And then finally, the third one, and this is something that is not in the cognitive app that we have with the Army currently, but being able to look at planning and execution cycles. And that's something that we're doing in the space domain. So those are cognitive indicators. That's what I mean by those.
Okay, so to try and improve my grade, this is extra credit round.
Okay, okay,
I
okay.
think what we're saying here is this at its core, for that commander or for that individual making a decision about whether or not they're going to pursue a given course of action, answers the question, do I want to engage now? That should help them make a data driven decision about whether or not the messaging should be delivered today, tomorrow, next week, what have you, and what the other actors on the field are doing to maybe need to be countered, or do we bring up a certain type of messaging one day or the next day? And that seems to me to have broad appeal, not
Yes.
just in, the military and psychological operations, but Lord knows in, the advertising industry where I've spent the last 10 years at
Yep.
Google. Like this question has great appeal there. Or even, organizations like the Global Engagement Center for the U.S. Department of State. They obviously want to make sure that the important messages, the good news that we're trying to sell about, hey, you can have self-determination and liberal democracy
Yep.
beats hands down communism.
That's
Like
right.
that's a message that
That's right.
lands one week and doesn't land the next week. That's a really important message to land.
That's right. And looking at, we're calling them systems or themes, and we're examining a whole bunch of different themes, which should be of interest to a wide variety of government agencies. And just to kind of tick off a few of them, we've got like 60 different themes, everything from unrest to telecommunications, space, social justice, children. Uh, Education, military, health, human rights, all these different themes, which would really mesh nicely, I think, with like the Global Engagement Center. But let me also just say real quick, if I may, Doug, that we're just super grateful to be working closely with the Army's Information Advantage Program Office, and it's the Army that is really leading the way on this. And I should also mention that part of being selected, to your points, part of being selected for this project with the Army is we had to make the case that you were just describing, that there is a very wide application space for the government. So yeah, Department of Treasury, the intelligence community, maybe the Department of Justice as well. And yeah, these large multinational companies, which are encoded with Western values, right? And they are operating globally as well. And so being able to, scoop them into this and leverage them to pursue Western goals would be dynamite.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Well, speaking of those other companies that are out there, there are others who are touching on this space, certainly, individual keywords that they're looking at, even something simple like Google Trends or
Hmm.
like, seeing that kind of stuff. You can get aspects of what you're doing, but what really sets this apart, or why do you feel like this solved a need that was otherwise unanswered?
Yeah, great question. Cognitive load. Cognitive load is the measure that we have developed, which I think is an extreme differentiator. And cognitive load is a term that people are starting to use more. I've been hearing it more, but frequently it's in the context of, hey, we need some technology which will help reduce the cognitive load on our special operators or reduce the cognitive load on aviators, right? And very valuable project, obviously, but we're talking about cognitive load in a different context. We're talking about measuring cognitive load at scale, globally, and leveraging it to create effects and to help gain and maintain information advantage and compete globally. This gets into our complexity science synthesis. And maybe I could just unpack that for just a moment and try not to go on too long about it because this is the stuff that really excites me, right? But we're really proud that we have synthesized the research and the well-respected theory from like thought leaders like Claude Shannon, who was the pioneer of information theory. And so we use Shannon's information entropy as part of this cognitive load. But then also people like Professor Yanir Bar-Yam, who was a previous guest on the podcast. I'll put a link to his episode in the show notes. But he told me that complexity and information and entropy, they're all kind of related. And when you munge it all together, it has something to contribute to the cognitive state of humans that are experiencing too much complexity or too much entropy. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the entropy of systems, the volume of information that is within the system, and then the change in the entropy. And when you munge all that together, you get this cognitive load measure, which is a crude, but effective estimate of the likelihood of people being cognitively overwhelmed. And so that is what we're doing, and that is what I think sets us apart from anything else that other people are doing out there.
All right. So again, to turn this into grunt speak, John, you've been away from the Marine Corps for a while now.
Yep.
So I'm still in the reserve, so I still got to back it up a little bit. So here's what I'm hearing, and I'm relating this to my own life. So my wife, I'm an absolutely ghastly cook, just truly
Hey,
awful.
me too, my brother.
So my wife shoulders that burden, and then now 3 kids in, she talks to me about the cognitive load associated with meal planning and getting these things done. And I said, babe, there's this great service, Marley Spoon and Healthy, and there's a Blue Apron and all these other little things that will send a box of pre-packed ingredients to you. And it's a recipe that you generally will like, and you don't really have to think much about. It's going to cost you 4 times as much, but you know what it means? You don't have to think about it, right? And she was ready to jump on it by the time I suggested it. I think what you're suggesting is at scale, you are determining how many other people are suffering from various versions of your husband sucks at cooking,
Mm.
and you just can't be bothered to think about it, and you are solving that problem in a unique and different way at scale. Am I right in
Totally.
suggesting that?
A plus, yeah.
Oh, John,
100%. 100%. And I didn't touch on this, but with this project that we're doing for the Army, we are using a publicly available data set that's called the GDEL data set, which stands for the Global Database of Events, Language, and Tone. Maybe you've heard of it, Doug. It's actually partially funded by Google. And the founder of that project, a guy named Kalev Lataro, was a guest on the podcast a couple of years ago too. Link in the show notes. But anyway, what the GDEL dataset does is it harvests like news feeds from all over the world, like a couple of thousand different outlets, right? And it identifies events that are happening, global events, and it's coding those events as being relatively cooperative, a diplomatic meeting, a trade deal, or relatively conflicting, actual hostilities or ethnic cleansing or threats of violence. All this stuff is being coded at scale. And so what we're doing is we're bringing in those events, we're creating these measures, and we're visualizing who the actors are, who the different themes are, who the people are that are having domestic problems like or solving domestic problems like you were, Doug. But all of these cognitive indicators go toward helping to identify government leaders or target audiences that are more likely to be cognitively overwhelmed, so that you can take advantage of that. Or it could be the other way around, right? It could be relatively underwhelmed. And when people are relatively underwhelmed, that is an opportunity as well. So all of this goes back to complexity being opportunity.
Makes perfect sense. Look, we missed it at the beginning, but I should slip it in here now. The opinions expressed do not reflect those of my wife, nor of the Marine Corps, Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, Google, or otherwise. So I don't want to be. I want to make sure that disclaimer is on there. My wife,
Smart
my
man.
wife can bear any cognitive burden.
Better late than never.
Yeah, indeed. Sorry.
Yeah.
Look, I want to move on to um, perhaps the more practical components of this, all joking aside. This really has a serious national security implication, because there are actors inside the world like China and Russia and North Korea who have actively tried to create an information environment that is insecure now. And I guess I'd love to know just practically. I know that, More Cowbell Unlimited is just getting going, and you've got more features that you're already alluding to that you want to add on, and it's still in progress. But what are some of the things that you have identified already, and what in your product is set up to aim to counter some of those things, particularly from those state actors, those state malevolent actors?
Right, right. Well, I think that this goes to the portion of our app, which is the OAI portion, the operations, activities, and indicators, to be able to visualize where state and non-state actors have been operating globally over the last 10 years, and being able to visualize it and animate it, even, so that you can get an idea of, where these organizations and governments have been expending energy. And within our user guide for the app, which people can check out, we've got a couple of visualizations along these lines. So looking at a 10-year period of time, you can visualize the difference in how these state actors have been engaging within Southcom, within South America over the last 10 years. And so looking at that visualization, Iran has been spending more of its time and resources in Argentina compared to Russia and China, whereas China, it appears, has been expending a lot more resources and energy in Ecuador. And you can also visualize this as a time series where the Ecuador maritime system relative has been slowly heating up over the past 10 years, and you can visualize this. Likewise, you can visualize differences in the way China has been engaging globally with respect to agriculture or mining or water. And so all of these things might be already known by the intelligence community or known by the people who care about this stuff. But again, these indicators can serve as corroborating evidence in order to bolster these kinds of findings. And we're just getting started, right? And so there's a whole lot more that can be discovered along these lines.
That's really interesting and insightful. I'm by no means a Southcom specialist, but it is interesting to hear that despite completely different language groups involved, that China would be more active in Ecuador and Iran
Argentina.
more active in Patagonia and
Argentina.
That's
Argentina.
Yeah, that's quite unique.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that the Marine in me is immediately crying out like, oh, okay, so what do we do about that, right? Like, we don't want to just admire the problem on the side. It's an interesting thought piece. And look, I'm not saying that analysis doesn't have its place, but certainly from a person who cares about liberal democracies in the world's perspective, I guess I'd love to know, what do you do? What's the ideal use of that data to help safeguard those liberal democratic traditions that we care about? So how can somebody use that visualization of, say, Iran leaning into Argentina and and turn that into something that makes their operations more effective?
Yeah, so what I was describing is like a decade-long examination that demonstrates that kind of resource expenditure. But you can just as easily, take that finding and say, okay, so we need to be tuned in to Iran and Argentina or China and Ecuador. Okay, got it. Now, let's start monitoring that area month over month over month or week over week over week, right? And then back to those cognitive indicators that indicate the likelihood of overwhelm and this, that, and the other. Let's say you're planning a key leader engagement with the minister of pick the relevant department within Argentina, agriculture or forestry, or the Secretary of Transportation within Ecuador, or the Port Authority in Ecuador, right? And you can use these measures to make an estimate of the cognitive state of that key leader within those countries, and use that to help inform the key leader engagement. Or I was talking with a DoD outfit about a workflow along those lines, where if you have a key leader engagement scheduled for a month from now or 6 weeks from now, then you can put together a workflow to help prep the battlefield, or to prep that key leader engagement before, during, and after, with some sort of an influence operation, or designed to support that key leader engagement, and use these cognitive indicators to help assist with all of that.
All right, that makes sense. So you're prepping your key front facing individuals or your key messaging to make sure that it lands, right? You don't want to
Yeah,
be pouring water on a sponge, as it were, and just letting an already full sponge and letting it run off. You know which messages are going to land and where it's going
yeah,
to soak in. That
yep,
that makes a lot of
yep.
sense. But cognitively, on the user experience side of this, from the person sitting between the chair and the screen for the product that you've just made, this is not easy for a grunt like me. Maybe you've made it so simple that onboarding is trivial and folks are able to move in. Can you tell me about how you're helping users understand what we've just talked about in this podcast, and broadly, um, how much cognitive load impacts the environment that they're in, how they can interact with the tool? What does onboarding look like? And can I expect a lance corporal, or a um, very busy senior executive service member who has 5 or 10 minutes
Hmm.
to look at a
Hmm.
whole slide deck to ingest the information that you're putting in front of them? What's that look like?
Yeah. So so far, we have distributed 50, 60, test user accounts to people who have been interested, and the feedback has been really positive. Not only from the Army's Information Advantage Program Office, but also from the information professionals community, right? And so onboarding is pretty easy, and we're currently looking for opinions and feedback from others. So anybody who wants to provide their opinion and feedback, please get in touch with me, let me know, and we're happy to provide you with a demo account. There is a learning curve to this. It is a new way, I believe, of looking at the information environment and identifying new opportunities, and then engaging potentially at scale, right? And so there's a learning curve to it. But I'm really fortunate to have a couple of really awesome IO gunslingers working with me, very experienced guys. There's one military fella and then a civilian who is helping our software engineers design this platform so that it's accessible and usable with a minimal amount of training. And so we're still building it, right? And so we're looking for that kind of feedback to help make it better. But we're also working to bring up more findings and more, like data products or, demonstrations of workflows so that people can more easily connect the dots and see, I think I see how I can use this. So it's all a big work in process, Doug.
Well, look, I was very impressed with it. I used the tool a couple of weeks ago, and that's when I really, I think I put threatened to put a letter bomb in the mail if you didn't
Yeah.
shout it from the rooftops the things you've done. Um, I found it to be relatively intuitive, and I will also say that having worked in software development for some time now, the speed with which you have turned around some of those feedback pieces that I gave you is remarkable. Under 2 weeks is quite remarkable. Well
Yeah.
done. Um, so look, it may be a little too early to tell, but have there been any real world operations where this is impacted, or if not, I guess what has been the feedback from real world practitioners about, oh, this could have done that had it existed? Talk to me about how
Yeah.
this has interacted with real world.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not aware yet of any real world case studies and success stories, but just yesterday, and we're recording this on Thursday, the 26th. Just yesterday, we had a chat with a group of war who were describing to us the way that they would use the app, and it was the first time I had heard about using it for what they called value mapping, left and right, and supply chain kind of analysis, and looking at OAIs, or operations activities and indicators with companies, foreign companies that are operating and represent, backing by various different governments, right? And so they are very interested in having us include more companies in our analyses so that they can identify where those companies are popping up in the news so that they can do that left right value mapping. So that's a one pretty powerful use case that I would assume would be applicable globally. Public affairs, right? We talked about the tribes of influence, so public affairs and civil affairs too, but there's a public affairs Air Force officer who is really gung ho on this, and he's interested to use it in order to time his content generation based upon audience cognitive load, to do just what you were describing a minute ago, Doug, to time engagements based upon the audience receptivity based upon their cognitive load. I mentioned like key leader engagement dossiers. Potentially, there's another portion of the app that I didn't describe yet, but we've got an examination of news outlets, global news outlets, split up by combatant command, and being able to look at the complexity of the outputs and making an inference about the audiences that are consuming that information by outlet. And so you can potentially use that to improve your messaging by target audience depending upon the outlet that they're receiving information. And then finally, and this is something I should have mentioned way back up at the top, but this 10-year look, this decade-long examination of these cognitive load measures, or these cognitive indicators, is something that the Army PSYOP community asked for explicitly, because they're looking for what they call a generational story of influence. And influence is not something that happens within a day or a week. Sometimes it takes months or potentially even years for influence activities to manifest, right? And so having this decade-long examination of these various different systems will help tell a story, so that we can, all get on the same page as far as what has been happening over time.
You know, there are rarely as many people who I've met, or there are rarely people who I've met like you, who are trying to both take a long-term and a short-term view on
Mhm.
this information environment. And look, I want to ask you a question, but I don't want to in any way suggests that what you're doing is not already incredibly ambitious. All right. So please don't take it as a criticism.
Okay.
I guess the question I wanted to ask is around emerging threats and evolving both the platform to address those emerging threats, but not losing what you've got. How do you think about staying ahead of this? This is a bit like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? Like as soon as you observe it, it starts to change, right? And undoubtedly, some of your great insights are going to leak out, and those who would do us harm are going to start noticing, and they're going to start changing their TTP, their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and you're just going to have to deal with the next thing. Like, what was the original quote that you brought up? It's this is a chronic disease and it can only be managed, something like that, right? So I don't want to say congratulations, good new product. Now when are you going to make the next feature? When you don't take it like that. But it's an interesting tension as a product leader and as a CEO. How are you thinking through staying ahead of the curve?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and to put your question in complex or complexity science terms, what you're describing could be thought of as second order cybernetics, which is basically as soon as someone knows that they're being observed, it changes their behavior, right? And so the second order cybernetics assumes that you're being watched, and so you adjust your behavior because you know you're being watched. But then there are potentially ways to, watch the watcher and go on and on and on. Anyway, that starts getting pretty mind bending, and I'm not
It's
prepared.
turtles all the way down, John.
That's
paranoia all the way down.
That's right. I've got a policy never to do math in public, and I should do the same thing with second order cybernetics. But there is, so yes, we are, racing forward with the next thing here, and I'm going to introduce a new term here. All right, ontology. Uh, but everything that
Go
we're
easy
doing.
on our listeners, John. Some are listening late in the day. We're back to philosophy class now. We've gone from cybernetics to ontology. Remind me, take me back to philosophy. What's the ontology?
If everybody, if we still have listeners, what we've developed is what's considered a cognitive indicator ontology, and that's a fancy word for basically saying that it's a very structured data framework which is highly interoperable and can play nicely with other data structures, right? And so the idea here is to take what we're doing and put it into these purpose-built analytics environments, which are popping up all over the government, so that our cognitive indicators can then inform these purpose-built LLMs, which are, being used for everything from contested logistics to the Army has a project called Project Linchpin. There's a really cool Army project that is they're asking for proposals right now, which is all about using LLMs to improve course of action development, right? And so our cognitive indicators can be converted into text, which identifies, basically think of these cognitive indicators as being at this moment in time, at this place, the likelihood that these people are cognitively overwhelmed is high. And then that becomes a text label, and you stream that into the LLM environments in order to help these large language models create courses of action and outputs, which then reflect the cognitive state of people, of actors, on the global scene. So that is our next step: is to have this ontology informing these LLM environments through a cognitive lens.
Okay, so if I could play that back without using the word ontology, negative points for using the term in the explanation. I think what I'm hearing you say is, if I were let's take that dinner delivery service again. If I were a modern marketer and I wanted to, for instance, craft a message that was going to reach that person who is already burdened by a large amount of cognitive load overall and say, hey, I have a solution for you. I could feed your indicator into a version of, say, ChatGPT and say, hey, give me 10 tweets that I think would actually touch this person, that aren't going to be too dense. They're not going to give you the whole
Yep,
value proposition
that's
in
right.
120 characters because they're already overwhelmed. And that LLM can suggest text, can suggest
Yes,
messages that are better tailored based on, to again mix metaphors here, that already soaked sponge. If that sponge is
yes,
totally soaked, you don't want to pour much water on it because it can't absorb it, right? If it's not wet
that's
at
right.
all, pour it all in, right?
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Yep.
I'll take it. I'll take
No,
another.
nailed it. Nailed it.
I like it. I nailed it. I'll take that as an A plus
Yeah, yeah,
answer. Thank
yeah,
you, John,
yeah.
on the degree that doesn't have a certificate at the end. All right.
Right.
So, look, this is really interesting. You're building a new area, a new market, a new type of product that has not otherwise been thought of. To give myself negative points, in the world of philosophy, right? You are talking about what exists. You are creating a whole
Mm,
new
right.
product line. It is the ontology of a product. Does it
That's
exist or not?
exactly right. Yep.
And
Yep.
and that's hard.
Yeah.
Like nobody nobody um, thinks about um, trying to figure out how to fix a bicycle now, but because there's a million YouTube videos on it. But you realize 125 years ago, these things were revolutionary, and they were a bit scandalous even. And we worried about the morals of people and bicycles and all these other kinds of fun. How do you think about building a community when what you're dealing with is actually pretty sensitive, right? You're talking about how ideas affect people's brains. You're talking about a new concept, building a community that's positive, that reinforces the product, that reinforces the good values that we're aiming to move forward versus the malign ones that others are trying to push forward. How are you thinking about that? Or like, what do you think about collaboration and
Yep.
community building?
Yep. Yeah. Well, first of all, yes, it's hard. But I got to tell you, I really do think of myself as a happy warrior. I'm living my best life. I would rather be doing nothing else, right? And my wife and I talk about this kind of stuff. So, hard, yes, but there's nothing I'd rather be doing. And IPA, the Information Professionals Association, it's a great group of folks that are very supportive of one another, and so it's an amazing community of practitioners. I've met so many people. So many people have been helpful and supportive, and so you know that is the start of building a community around what we're doing with this capability. um, there's a conference. There's two conferences coming up. One is InfoPack in Hawaii at the end of October. Let's see, it's the week of October 21st through 25th. I'm going to be at that conference. I would love to engage and meet new people and talk about this with those folks at that conference. And then in Augusta, Georgia, there's an Information Advantage conference as well the following week. And so would love if you're listening, if you're going to be at either one of those conferences, please find me and let's chat.
Um, Look, for those of us who are scattered or deployed or otherwise interested but unable to get the direct face to face with John, which I would recommend. Again, none of you are seeing him on the screen, but it's very late at night, and he's still looking very handsome and totally worthwhile speaking to, even in a bedraggled state that he'll undoubtedly be after going from Hawaii to Georgia one week
Yep.
after another.
Yep.
But look, if there were people who were, you know, towing into this water skeptical, either because they're worried that, this is kind of the nuclear weapons of the cognitive industry that you're unleashing onto humanity, or skeptical that it's going to work, or skeptical that it's not going to just add one more thing, what would you offer about the importance of these kind of indicators as a final thought? Yeah, I'll leave it with that.
Well, um, I hope that people have not heard me say anything that would suggest that this is some kind of a comprehensive capability that is going to win the day or something like that. I'm being a little over the top there, but there is no one ring to rule them all. This is a capability that I think would be part of a tapestry or a constellation of capabilities to help Western democracy or to help democracies compete more effectively in the environment that we're in currently. I will say to skeptics, and I mentioned this earlier, that um, these these measures, these analyses that we're doing, are rooted in very well respected complexity science, information theory, and operations research. So there is that as well. So I guess that's how I'd answer your question.
Fair enough. I will just as again another person who's been out for a few years say that John, you have failed the Marine to civilian transition as a CEO. There is no problem that your product is not a panacea for. Just
Okay.
letting you know that is the
Okay.
standard answer to that
All right.
question.
All right. All
This
right.
this honest approach where you
Uh-huh.
say, "Hey, it
Yeah.
has capabilities and limitations, but doesn't
Yeah.
solve everything,"
Yeah.
that's not welcome for most
All right.
CEOs.
All right. All right. Well,
Um, okay. Well, look. Um, on More Cowbell Unlimited and what you're doing and the continued evolution of the product, we won't be able to unfortunately do this every week. What are the things that people can do to stay abreast of the new developments? How do they keep up with you and your non self promoting, non panacea self?
fortunately, there are very few John Bicknells on LinkedIn, and there's even fewer John Bicknells that are, the Cognitive Crucible podcast host and the CEO of More Cowbell Unlimited. So, the easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn, or you can find my email on our website. So, please, please, please reach out.
I am going to declare victory.
Okay,
This is
excellent.
excellent. I've overwhelmed the man who looks at cognitive overwhelm with questions. No, or he either that or he's going easy on me because he sees me slowly scrunching in my seat as he uses polysyllabic words. Um, okay, now back to our more traditional format on this. Like John, you have had many guests on your podcast. I know that you read broadly in an almost intimidating fashion, and you care deeply about academia. That's where a portion of this started in Monterey at NPS. If you were to offer a fruitful research question to academics or to those who are just coming out of school, what would that be?
I'm going to fail your simple test here again, Doug. I'm afraid to say, but there's another concept that I think is really relevant here, and uh, it's the concept of noise, statistical noise. And this is goes back to the work of Claude Shannon, and he developed a communication channel, which is a really simple thing. It's like you've got a sender, you've got a receiver, you've got noise that enters the channel, and some other stuff, but it's really pretty simple. And another way to think about what we're doing is we're measuring the noise in the environment, right? And so the research question would be is how can information operators, practitioners leverage the noise that is coming into these communication channels to more productively the help help the good guys pursue their goals. So that would be the research question that I think people should explore.
Interesting. Great work. And given that my first job in the Marine Corps was field radio operator, undoubtedly getting strangled by some officer like yourself with an H-250 because I couldn't get the noise out of the system and he couldn't hear battalion. I echo the need to pay attention to noise in the system and squelch it, as it were. Is there a good book that you would recommend to our listeners about what we've been talking about?
Yep, yep. And I'm going to give a shout out to the young man who is working with me right now. His name is Nick Carler. He's an Army PSYOP soldier. He's getting out. He's working with More Cowbell on a Hiring Our Heroes fellowship currently, and he's doing great work. And this is a book that Nick recommended to me, and it's still on my nightstand. So I've not read it yet, but it's called Maxwell's Demon and the Golden Apple. Global Discord in the New Millennium by Randall Schweiler. And it's all about entropy and how entropy is driving the politics and how it's inevitable and it's leads to the rise and fall of great powers and all this kind of stuff. So I have not read it yet myself, and so this is actually a task for me to read it, but I would also recommend it to our audience.
I would encourage all those who go and meet John at InfoPack in Augusta, Georgia, to quiz him deeply on the content. Did you ever make it through it? As a father of three, one of them being 18 months old at the present time, I would recommend Where is the Green Sheep?
Okay.
Significantly easier cognitive load. If you're feeling a bit cognitively overloaded through this podcast, I assure you, Where's the Green Sheep will be significantly easier than Maxwell's Demon and the Golden Apple.
There'll be links in the show notes to both.
Exactly.
Books.
It depends on how cognitively overloaded you are.
Yeah.
Okay, look, just for fun and to end on a bit of a light note here, all the listeners reached out to me. There was a crowd, crush before this podcast asking, John, what is there something about you? What's something fun and interesting about you that your listeners, your dedicated listeners, don't know?
Yep. Okay. Well, I'll do a twofer, a related twofer. And so you didn't ask me about, the origin of the More Cowbell Unlimited business name. A lot of people do, right? So it's a reference to a Saturday Night Live skit, right? And it has nothing to do with what my business does. It's just what I wanted to name my business. Me and the More Cowbell skit go back a long time, and you can look on the More Cowbell website, and on the About page, it has my bio and some stuff, but it also contains my signature block from when I was a lieutenant colonel and I was in Afghanistan with the Second MEB at Camp Leatherneck, right? And it says Lieutenant Colonel John Bicknell, blah, 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 MEB A, blah, 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 Camp Leatherneck. And way down at the very bottom, after the phone numbers and the email addresses, it says More Cowbell. And there's even a little umlaut over the O for More Cowbell, which is an homage to Blue Oyster Cult, which is the song that was in the More Cowbell skit, Don't Fear the Reaper. So there's just a little bit of a deep cut there on John Bicknell, who I am, what makes me tick, all that.
You're like an onion. I peel back and there's more layers as we go deep. I actually know the sketch that you're talking about for my sins. And I would like to ask an additional bonus question. Are you paying royalties to Christopher Walken and Will Ferrell for using the name of their sketch?
No, I'm not.
Be careful, John. Be careful.
Yeah, perhaps I should. But now that you mention it, just one last little deep cut there, which is another More Cowbell reference. So the name of our app is called Frankel, and Frankel was Will Ferrell's character's name in the More Cowbell skit. His name was Gene Frankel, and so the name of our app is Frankel, and you'll actually see that in the URL. If you get a user account, it'll say Frankel at morecowbell.com.
So final plug to all those out there: reach out, get a user account.
That's right.
See that one of the best SNL sketches lives on in your browser. John,
link
thank
in
you
the
so
show
much.
notes. Yeah.
Link in the show notes. Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for all that you do, all that you have done for our country, for the cause of liberal democracy, for continuing to fight the fight even out of uniform, and for educating us all on this and so many other topics. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.